Hello, I'm Frank Greitzer, and I'm happy to present my top 10 list for insider threat research and practice. This presentation is being brought to you by Cogility Software, where I serve as Chief Behavioral Scientist. To describe and justify my picks, there's a fair amount of information on each slide, along with some relevant references. I invite you to examine the presentation more fully and contact me with any questions. So let's get started. Number 10 on my list is establish a standard definition of insider threat, and especially a list of concerning threat behavior types. There's already a broad agreement on the definition of insider threats as the potential for an insider to use their authorized access to organizational resources in ways that may harm the organization or its assets. This can be either malicious or unintentional harm. But exactly how we characterize and distinguish different types of insider threats is not standardized today. Organizations might differ in the priority they assign to different types of threats based on their missions, but it would help if everyone would agree on a list of defined threats. Besides the 5 major threat types commonly identified as data exfiltration, sabotage, fraud, workplace violence, and unintentional insider threats, we may wish to distinguish threats of espionage, suicidal ideation, and threats posed by domestic extremists or terrorists, such as acts of political violence. I also listed here an obscure type of internal threat or risk that I've referred to as cyber-friendly fire. All these types of internal threats and risks are shown in a big picture diagram that I developed about a decade ago. The diagram shown here is an updated version of the original that was published in a 2014 paper on cyber-friendly fire. The focus of this depiction of cyber information assurance failures is on insider threats, and these are outlined in red. You see that the set of threat types is divided into malicious versus non-malicious actions. The various malicious insider threats are on the left side, and I have accommodated domestic terrorist threats and suicidal ideation in this new diagram. On the right side, showing unintentional insider risks, I delineated the 3 major types comprising outsmarted insiders, mistaken insiders, and negligent insiders. You'll also note that I include the concept of cyber-friendly fire, which represents risks posed by cyber defenders who may inadvertently, through actions or inaction, impact system vulnerability. Various organizations or government agencies are taking steps to taxonomize frameworks that describe insider threat indicators, but they should also seek to use consistent categories of insider threat types, even if they assign different priorities to these different threat types. Next, we have challenge number 9, establishing comprehensive counter-insider threat programs. As I've argued in many previous papers and talks, traditional approaches to insider threat mitigation focus on technical indicators, workstation and network monitoring systems that generate billions of events each week that cybersecurity analysts must attempt to deal with. Often, however, the accumulation of risk based solely on cyber technical indicators becomes critical only as the incident is being executed, much too late for any sort of proactive mitigation. Insider threat is a human problem. Research and case studies show us that the vast majority of malicious insider attacks are preceded by observed social behavioral precursors that could have been addressed before the attack. If such psychosocial data had been included in an overall more comprehensive approach, there might have been a greater opportunity to intervene, to provide a helping hand, and mitigate the risk before the incident occurred. A more comprehensive approach that includes behavioral indicators provides an opportunity to get left of harm. Challenge number 8 on my top 10 list is to establish a common framework for understanding and representing potential risk indicators, or PRIs. Of course, there have been numerous frameworks or taxonomies offered to organize our knowledge about contributing factors, warning signs, and concerns that we identify as PRIs along the critical pathway to insider risk. I prefer to use an ontology, a more formal framework that allows me to define multiple associations among concepts instead of a simple one-dimensional taxonomy. The SOFIT ontology for socio-technical and organizational factors for insider threat, which was developed under IARPA funding, provides a comprehensive framework that includes behavioral, technical, and organizational factors. It defines over 300 indicators and has been used or has influenced the construction of a variety of insider threat knowledge bases and PRI listings. In the U.S. government, several PRI frameworks have been defined, including one for the U.S. Department of Defense and one established by the U.S. Department of the Treasury. While there are strong similarities among the various frameworks, additional standardization and resolution of inconsistencies in their respective hierarchical structures may yield more consistent applications of these frameworks. It's also important to identify PRIs that can help identify people who are at risk before they commit insider exploits in order to support more proactive mitigation strategies. Next, we come to challenge number 7. After we have settled on a consistent framework specifying threat types and organizing the associated PRIs, we must develop methods for reliably estimating the strength of these indicators. I refer to this as PRI calibration, estimating the relative extent to which the observation of a particular PRI is indicative of a particular insider threat behavior type. A given PRI may be associated with one or more threat types. As we have seen in previous research, we know that PRIs are not all the same. They do not contribute equally to assessment of risk for a given threat type, and a particular PRI will have varying weight or strength of association across different threat types. For example, someone who exhibits a series of failed login attempts does not represent as high a concern as someone who disables security features. These PRIs contribute differentially to judgments of potential threat. As another example, PRIs that reflect possible workplace violence will not necessarily be relevant when assessing the potential risk of information theft or espionage. To support threat assessment modeling, we use various methods for extracting expert knowledge or opinion about the strength of association between a given PRI and a particular threat behavior of interest. We refer to this as the PRI strength or its weight or level of concern, and it can be estimated using various scaling methods. I have used all sorts of approaches, including a 0 to 100 scale for level of concern, and methods that attempt to gauge the probability that a PRI is associated with a given insider threat type. People aren't very good at estimating probabilities. Certain biases occur, especially when estimating the likelihood of rare events. Recently, my research has aimed to extract probabilistic weights using likelihood ratio estimates. This is an area of research that deserves further attention. When we ask our experts to provide judgments about PRI weights or probabilities, we should recognize that we really don't know what the analyst is thinking. Are they able to cleanly identify the probability we seek? Or is it possible that they might be conflating the probability concept and the perceived impact of the target behavior? If our models assume we're dealing with probabilities, but our subject matter experts are using some unknown mix of their assessment of the seriousness of a given PRI, how will this affect the validity of our model? For those of us who are pursuing probabilistic models, I would urge that there's a need to be very careful about how we go about the expert knowledge elicitation process. Now we come to number 6 on my top 10 list, developing computational approaches for propagating risk. After defining target threat types to assess, identifying contributing factors and warning signs, defined by PRIs, and calibrating these PRIs to establish their weights in contributing to a given threat type, we must develop predictive methods to derive threat values for observed combinations of PRIs. Of course, there's a wide range of approaches. The most basic and most traditional cybersecurity approach is to base your response on alerts that come from traditional host network monitoring appliances like intrusion detection, data loss prevention, and the like. Now, these are purely reactive methods that will be unlikely to provide any advance warning of potential risks. Instead of relying on singular measures and alerting tools, one can count the number of alerts. This counting model aggregates more information, but it's still a vast oversimplification because it implicitly assumes that all PRIs are equally indicative of risk. Research has shown that models that aggregate differential risk values provide better estimates that more closely match expert judgments. Examples of these types of models are those that simply add the weights of individual PRIs, or those that use probabilistic computations, such as Bayesian networks, to compute risks. These methods provide a closer match to expert judgments, but there still seems to be room for improvement. Our research suggests that insider threat indicators have dynamic properties that are not addressed by simple computational models. First, expert judgment studies tell us that there are different time spans over which PRIs influence judgments of risk. If I told you that someone exhibited a series of failed login attempts, say 4 months ago, with no other issues after that, this would probably not lead you to act. Perhaps they were having a bad day, or they recently changed their password. But if the observable were related to interpersonal problems like bullying, intimidation, or a personality trait like narcissism, that would be a different story because we know that many psychological characteristics, particularly personality traits, tend to be very stable over time. So we expect that different types of PRIs will exhibit varying decay characteristics, and generally we find this to be the case, although more research is needed here as well. Another aspect of PRI dynamics is the influence of different patterns or combinations of PRIs on expert judgments of insider threat risk. We find that some combinations of PRIs may have a greater influence on judgments of threat than other sets of PRIs. In some cases, a combination of PRIs might decrease the judged threat level for one type of threat, but perhaps increase the threat level of another type of threat. Some combinations make sense. A scenario in which we see a lot of disgruntlement and sense of grievance, along with a collection of suspicious technical violations, is very consistent with an exfiltration exploit, but perhaps less consistent with espionage, because a spy attempts to be invisible and fly below the radar, while the disgruntled staff member may allow emotions to be revealed in concerning behaviors. In the example shown on this slide, we found that while the risk values computed for two cases were nearly identical, both predicting that the cases would fall at the 90th percentile of risk, our subject matter experts demonstrated that only case 2 was relatively highly concerning, while case 1 was not. Case 2 represents a pattern or collection of PRIs that suggest a realistic scenario. One can see elements of motivation and concerning behaviors in that case. But case 1 lacks any concerning behaviors. It suggests that an individual may have interpersonal problems, but so far at least has not acted out against the organization. Considerations of this nature lead me to believe that the most successful approaches will incorporate pattern-based analyses in a behavioral analytic threat assessment model, such as Cogility's Cogent platform. Next, we come to challenge number 5, validating insider threat models. Insider threat is a wicked, hard problem. The incidents are rare, and real-world data are hard to come by. Ground truth, which is needed to compare with model predictions, is rarely known in sufficient level of detail to support this evaluation. Organizations are understandably reluctant to release the data. For these and other reasons, the Information Security Research Council ranked insider threat as number 2 on their InfoSec hard problems list, and the problems that were identified at that time persist to this day. One way to deal with the lack of ground truth is to compare model predictions with expert ratings or judgments of risk for real or synthetic test cases. Several examples of published work that use expert judgments as proxies for ground truth are listed here. There are also some data banks or synthetic insider threat test cases that are available, including a data set used by Carnegie Mellon's CERT program to support validation. For testing purposes, there are various statistical means of validating model predictions. A model produces threat scores for the population of data. We can compare the distribution of predicted scores with our proxies for ground truth. If our models are defined for specific threat types, the predicted risk scores may be thought of as a vector. The example shown here assumes that 8 risk scores are computed, one prediction for each threat type covered by the model. To test predictions, we compare the distribution of the model outputs with the distribution of observed scores, that is, expert judgments. A correlation coefficient between predicted values and expert judgments can provide a measure, and R² indicates the percentage of variance accounted for. Another method is to set different alerting thresholds and derive a receiver operating characteristic curve. By computing percentages of true positives versus false positives or false negatives, we can develop additional measures called precision and recall that may also be used. Much of what I've discussed so far has been rooted in technical concepts. The remaining challenges are of a more programmatic nature. Number 4 on my top 10 list emphasizes the importance of addressing organizational factors. Most frameworks for insider threat focus on insiders per se, but there's a large body of research in human factors and organizational psychology that argues against blaming users exclusively for outcomes that may also have systemic underlying causes. Here I'm referring to organizational factors that may produce all sorts of insider risks. Deficient or even toxic organizational systems and practices can create a breeding ground for insider threats. Most organizations already have relevant data collected through workforce surveys that assess organizational climate and culture with insights into staff morale, engagement, cohesion, and work-life balance, as well as management practices, and especially leadership styles and toxic leadership concerns. While climate surveys are typically used for other purposes, these types of organizational factor data can inform a holistic, supportive approach to mitigating insider risk. Top 10 challenge number 3, research on unintentional insider threats. As pointed out in the Poneman DTEC's Cost of Insider Risk Report, 3/4 of insider incidents are attributed to unintentional insider threats, which may be characterized as negligent insiders, who are careless or inattentive, mistaken insiders, whose actions are attributed to human error, and outsmarted insiders, who are duped by malicious adversaries. These non-malicious incidents are not only more prevalent than malicious attacks, but they also account for comparable or higher costs of remediation. An initial examination of contributing factors was done in a 2014 study, and the results were incorporated into the soffit ontology. More recently, we examined dozens of technical and behavioral factors in a large phishing study that demonstrated the futility of relying on technical indicators to identify people who are more susceptible to phishing exploits. We found that one of the most predictive indicators was whether or not they were successfully phished in the past, suggesting that psychosocial factors may be at play. More research is needed here, but we are well advised to heed a long history of research on human reliability and human error, revealing that organizational factors such as excessive workload or toxic management systems increase stress, which in turn increases the likelihood of errors and lapses that underlie many unintentional insider incidents. Next, we come to number 2 on my list, resolving privacy versus security issues in monitoring of social media. It's obvious that social media today represents a major factor both as a reflection of how people think about the world and as a vehicle for influencing attitudes and behavior. By examining an individual's social media activity, we can gain insights about a person's personality. Their likes can reveal real-world attitudes and beliefs. We also appreciate the impact of social media information, and especially disinformation or misinformation campaigns on human behavior, where we've seen how extremist postings can produce political violence or hate crimes. Nevertheless, to date, there is no specific policy guidance for monitoring of social media. The US government certainly, but also society in general, must confront the privacy versus security issues head on and resolve this controversy. We need to establish guidelines for what constitutes reportable social media activity, how much social media data should be weighed against other sources of data. How do we assess the severity of content? And how do we assess the level of concern for online utterances or likes? While some social media sites are open, others, such as Discord, are not. How do we decide what level of monitoring is appropriate? Resolving these questions requires serious discussions and debate by all stakeholders so that a fully transparent path forward can be defined with buy-in at all levels. And finally, for me, the number one need for insider threat research and practice is active engagement of human resources and other stakeholders. Traditionally, an incident response team includes cybersecurity and security professionals, and its name literally means it is reactive. In order to achieve a more proactive and supportive insider risk program, we need to replace the concept of incident response with a more comprehensive, integrated, and holistic insider risk mitigation approach, and an insider threat team with active engagement by human resources and other stakeholders that aims to prevent and deter insider risk. This is the path towards a highly mature and effective insider threat program. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I've provided some additional reading material if you'd like to dive into some of these in more detail. And on this final slide, I've listed all 10 of my top 10 challenges for insider threat research and practice for your consideration and for possible future discussion. Thank you very much.